the most satisfying time I've seen instant karma. Let me tell you about my brother and the biggest financial disaster I've ever witnessed firsthand. When my brother Jake and I were in our 20s, he had this scheme that made everyone in our city absolutely hate him. He would find small concerts happening and wait outside the ticket office for them to open. Then he'd buy up as many tickets as possible so nobody else could, then resell them for double the price. People hated him for this, but they didn't have a choice when their favorite bands came to play. He managed to do this for months and made well over $50,000. I even saw posters of his face around calling him a public enemy because people hated what he did so much. But no matter how much they hated him, nobody could do anything about it. Eventually, he tried to take it to the next level. He heard an upcoming rapper named Snoop Dogg was coming to our city and bought over 2,000 tickets the second they came out. If all went well, he would have turned $20,000 into well over $40,000. However, since Snoop was so popular, word got around what he had done and even got back to Snoop Dogg himself. A few days after he did this, I woke up to the sound of him screaming and punching walls. I shot out of bed and asked him what happened, and he yelled that Snoop Dogg canceled the show. He found out someone bought almost all of the tickets so they could resell them, so he canceled it. The tickets were non-refundable, but that was just the beginning of Jake's downfall. What I didn't know at the time was that he'd borrowed $15,000 from some very dangerous people to make that Snoop Dogg purchase happen. My brother had gotten greedy, and greed, as I was about to learn, has a way of destroying everything you touch. I should probably start from the beginning to help you understand just how deep this rabbit hole went. Jake and I grew up in a middle-class family in Cleveland. Our dad worked at the steel mill, our mom was a secretary at the local elementary school. Jake was 2 years older than me, and from the time we were kids, he always had these schemes to make quick money. In elementary school, he'd buy candy bars from the dollar store and sell them at school for triple the price. In high school, he was selling bootleg CDs, and later, when smartphones became a thing, he was selling cracked phones with custom software. He could talk his way into or out of anything. He was the kind of guy who could convince you that the sky was green if he really wanted to. Our parents thought his entrepreneurial spirit was admirable, even if they didn't always approve of his methods. "That boy's going to be rich someday," Dad would say, shaking his head but smiling. After high school, Jake went to community college for about 6 months before dropping out. He said formal education was for people who lacked vision. I, on the other hand, stuck with it and got my degree in business administration. Not because I was more disciplined, but because I'd seen enough of Jake's schemes to know that most of them ended badly for everyone involved except Jake himself. The ticket scalping thing started small. Jake had always been into music, and he knew the local scene better than anyone. He'd hang out at record stores, chat with the owners, follow local bands on social media. He knew which shows would sell out and which ones would be duds. At first, he'd just buy a few extra tickets to shows he was planning to attend anyway, then sell the extras to friends or on Craigslist. But Jake was never one to think small. Within a few months, he'd turned it into a full-time operation. He'd wake up at 5 a.m. to be first in line when ticket sales opened. He had multiple credit cards, multiple email addresses, multiple phone numbers. He'd coordinate with a network of people he'd hired to help him buy tickets from different locations simultaneously. The money started rolling in fast. Jake moved out of our parents' house and into a nice apartment downtown. He bought a BMW, started wearing designer clothes, eating at expensive restaurants. He'd flash rolls of cash like he was some kind of rap star. Our parents were worried but also impressed. Our relatives started asking Jake for financial advice. Our mom would brag to her friends about her successful entrepreneur son. I was working at a small accounting firm at the time, making $35,000 a year and living in a studio apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't jealous. Jake was making more in a month than I made in 6 months, and he was doing it without having to sit in a cubicle for 40 hours a week. But I also saw the other side of it. I saw the angry messages he'd get on social media. I saw the nasty comments on the local news website whenever they'd do a story about ticket scalping. One time, we were out at a bar together and this guy recognized Jake from the posters that had been put up around town. The guy got in Jake's face, called him a parasite, said he was ruining music for everyone. Jake just laughed it off, bought the guy a beer, and somehow by the end of the night they were best friends. That was Jake's superpower. He could charm anyone. The hate campaign against him had started about 6 months into his ticket scalping career. Someone had created a Facebook page called Stop the Cleveland Ticket Vampire with Jake's photo as the profile picture. They'd post the locations where he was known to buy tickets, encouraging people to get there early to beat him. They'd share screenshots of his inflated ticket prices, organize boycotts of shows he was scalping. Someone with graphic design skills had made these wanted-style posters with Jake's photo and the words "Public Enemy" on across the top. Below that, it listed his crimes against music and his estimated profits. They were professionally printed and appeared overnight on telephone poles, bus stops, coffee shop bulletin boards everywhere. Jake actually thought they were hilarious. He had one framed in his apartment. "Any publicity is good publicity," he'd say. "They're just making me more famous." The local media picked up on the story. Jake did interviews with 2 different newspapers and a local TV station. He was articulate, well-dressed, and completely unapologetic. He'd explain that he was just participating in a free market economy, that if people were willing to pay his prices, that proved there was demand. He'd point out that major ticketing companies like StubHub and Ticketmaster were doing the same thing on a larger scale. "I'm providing a service," he'd say. "I'm taking the risk by buying these tickets up front. If the show doesn't sell out, I lose money. If it does, I profit. That's capitalism." The interviews only made people hate him more, but they also made him more confident. Jake started talking about expanding to other cities, maybe franchising his operation. He talked about writing a book about entrepreneurship, maybe getting his own TV show. That's when things started to get weird. Jake began getting paranoid about competition. He'd hired a few people to help him buy tickets, but he was worried they might go into business for themselves. He started making them sign non-compete agreements that probably weren't legally enforceable. possible. He'd have them followed to make sure they weren't secretly buying tickets for themselves. Before, he'd focused mainly on smaller venues, places that held 500 to 1,000 people, but the bigger money was in the larger venues. The arena shows. Those required more capital upfront, but the profit margins were incredible. That's where the dangerous people came in. Jake had maxed out his credit cards and cleaned out his savings account buying tickets for a series of shows in the spring. He'd made good money on those, but he'd immediately reinvested everything into the next batch of shows. He was living month to month, which was insane given how much money he was making. But Jake had never been good with money management. He was a feast or famine kind of guy. When he heard Snoop Dogg was coming to town, he saw dollar signs. Snoop was huge, the show would definitely sell out, and tickets were going for $50 80 retail. He could easily resell them for $150 200 each, maybe more. But he needed $20,000 upfront to buy the quantity he wanted, and he didn't have it. That's when he met Tommy Marconi. Tommy wasn't his real name, obviously, but that's what everyone called him. He was the kind of guy you'd see in movies about organized crime, gold chains, expensive suit, slicked back hair, the works. He ran a legitimate business during the day, something to do with construction, but everyone knew. He also lent money to people who couldn't get loans through traditional banks. Jake had met Tommy through a mutual friend at a poker game. When Jake mentioned needing capital for a big score, Tommy was interested. The terms seemed reasonable at first. $15,000 loan, to be paid back within 60 days with 20% interest. That would be $18,000 total, which sounded manageable given that Jake was expecting to make over $40,000 on the Snoop Dogg tickets. What Jake didn't fully understand, or chose to ignore, were the consequences of not paying on time. Tommy wasn't the kind of lender who'd just ding your credit score or send you nasty letters. Tommy had other methods of debt collection. The morning Jake woke up screaming about Snoop Dogg canceling the show, I thought his reaction was a bit extreme. I mean, yeah, losing $20,000 sucks, but Jake had been making good money. Surely he had enough saved up to cover it, right? Wrong. Over the next few days, as Jake's panic became more obvious, I started piecing together just how bad his situation really was. He'd been living paycheck to paycheck despite making huge amounts of money. Every dollar that came in got immediately reinvested into the next batch of tickets. He had maybe $3,000 in his checking account, nowhere near enough to cover his debt to Tommy. You borrowed money from a loan shark? I asked him when he finally admitted the truth. We were sitting in his apartment, surrounded by stacks of worthless Snoop Dogg tickets. Jake looked like he hadn't slept in days. He's not a loan shark, Jake said defensively. He's a legitimate businessman. Jake, legitimate businessmen don't break people's legs when they don't pay. Nobody's going to break my legs. I just need to figure out a way to make this money back quickly. That's when Jake's desperation really kicked in. He started trying to sell the Snoop Dogg tickets anyway, even though the show had been canceled. He'd post them on Craigslist with vague descriptions, hoping to scam people who hadn't heard the news. When that didn't work, he started considering more drastic options. I could sell them as collectibles, he said. You know, like rare canceled concert tickets or something? Jake, that's fraud. It's creative marketing. This went on for about a week. Jake would come up with increasingly desperate schemes to recoup his losses. I'd point out why they wouldn't work or were illegal, and he'd get angry at me for not being supportive. Meanwhile, the deadline to pay Tommy back was getting closer. Then Jake disappeared. I didn't hear from him for 3 days. His phone went straight to voicemail. He wasn't answering texts, and when I went to his apartment, his car wasn't there. I started wondering if Tommy had already gotten to him, if I should call the police or what. Finally, Jake called me from a number I didn't recognize. I'm in Detroit, he said. I'm staying with cousin. Rick, what are you doing in Detroit? Hiding, obviously. Look, I need you to do me a favor. Jake's plan was for me to go to his apartment, pack up some of his stuff, and meet him halfway between Cleveland and Detroit. He'd give me a list of things to grab, some clothes, important documents, and a shoebox from his bedroom closet that he said contained emergency cash. I should have told him to grow up and face his problems like an adult. But Jake was my brother, and despite everything, I couldn't just abandon him. The apartment was a mess when I got there. It looked like Jake had left in a hurry. There were clothes scattered around, dirty dishes in the sink, stacks of unsold tickets everywhere. I found the shoebox in his closet and opened it. Inside was about $8,000 in cash, not nearly enough to pay off Tommy, but more money than I'd ever seen in one place. As I was packing Jake's stuff, I heard a knock at the door. My blood went cold. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 large men in dark suits standing in the hallway. One of them knocked again, harder this time. Jake Kowalski, one of them called out. We know you're in there. Mr. Marconi wants to have a conversation. I held my breath and tried to stay perfectly still. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes, I heard their footsteps walking away down the hallway. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to move, then quickly grabbed Jake's stuff and got out of there as fast as I could. Meeting Jake at a rest stop outside Toledo was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. My brother, who just months earlier had been living like a king, looked like a homeless person, and that, well, he'd lost weight, his expensive clothes were wrinkled and dirty, and he had this haunted look in his eyes. Did anyone follow you? Were his first words. I don't think so. Jake, this is insane. You can't spend the rest of your life running from these guys. 2, I have a plan. Jake's plan was to lay low in Detroit for a few weeks while he figured out how to make enough money to pay Tommy back. He'd been talking to some people Rick knew about getting into the drug business, just temporarily, just until he could get back on his feet. Are you out of your mind? I said. You want to go from ticket scalping to dealing drugs? It's good money, and it's fast money. I could make 15 grand in a couple weeks if I play it right. That's when I realized that Jake had learned absolutely nothing from this experience. He was still looking for get-rich-quick schemes, still convinced that he could outsmart the system, still unable to see that his own greed greed and poor decision-making had gotten him into this mess. I tried to talk sense into him, but it was like talking to a wall. Jake's mind was made up. He was going to become a drug dealer to pay off his debt to a loan shark, because that seemed like a logical next step to him. We argued for about an hour in that rest stop parking lot. Other travelers kept staring at us, probably wondering why two guys in their 20s were having such an intense conversation next to a picnic table. Finally, I gave up. Fine, I said. Do whatever you want, but I'm not helping you anymore. This is where I draw the line. Come on, man. You're my brother. Exactly. Which is why I'm not going to enable you to destroy your life even more than you already have. I left Jake there at that rest stop with his bag of clothes and his $8,000 in cash. I drove back to Cleveland feeling like the worst brother in the world, but also knowing that I couldn't let Jake drag me down with him. For the next month, I barely heard from Jake. He'd text me occasionally to let me know he was alive, but he wouldn't tell me what he was doing or where exactly he was staying. I assumed he'd gone through with his drug dealing plan, and I was terrified that the next call I got would be from the police telling me he'd been arrested or shot. Meanwhile, things in Cleveland were getting interesting. The story of Jake's Snoop Dogg disaster had gotten out, and people were celebrating. The local newspaper ran a follow-up article with the headline, "Karma Catches Up with Cleveland's Most Hated Scalper." The Facebook page that had been campaigning against him was throwing a virtual party. Someone even organized an actual party at one of the venues Jake used to frequent, calling it the Ticket Vampire's Funeral. I went to that party, which was probably a mistake. I thought maybe I could just blend in, have a beer, see what people were saying, but someone recognized me as Jake's brother, and suddenly I was surrounded by people wanting to know where he was, whether it was true that he'd lost all his money, whether he was really hiding from loan sharks. I tried to play dumb, but these people had done their research. They knew Jake's full name, they knew our family, they knew I worked at Henderson and Associates accounting firm. One guy, who introduced himself as Marcus, said he'd been tracking Jake's operation for months. "Your brother single-handedly ruined the music scene in this city," Marcus said. He was a thin guy with thick glasses and a vintage band t-shirt. "Do you have any idea how many shows I missed because of him? How many of my friends couldn't afford tickets because he jacked up the prices? Look, I understand people are angry," I said, "but Jake's my brother. I can't control what he does. You could have stopped him." "How? You're an accountant, right? You could have looked at his finances, told him he was being reckless." That stung because it was partially true. I had seen warning signs that Jake was overextending himself financially, but I'd assumed he knew what he was doing. He was making so much money that it seemed impossible he could be in real trouble. The conversation with Marcus and the others at that party made me realize something important. Jake's ticket scalping hadn't just been a business to him. It had been a form of power. He'd enjoyed being hated, enjoyed being the villain, enjoyed knowing that he could control whether or not people got to see their favorite bands. The money was important, but the psychological payoff of being the guy everyone loved to hate was just as important. That's why his downfall was so complete and so satisfying to everyone else. It wasn't just that a greedy person had lost money. It was that someone who had been flaunting his power over others had been brought down by his own hubris. About 6 weeks after Jake disappeared, I got a call from him. This time he sounded different, not panicked or desperate, but tired and defeated. "I'm coming home," he said. "What about Tommy?" I talked to him. We worked something out. Jake wouldn't give me details over the phone, but he said he'd be back in Cleveland in a few days and would explain everything then. He asked if he could crash at my place for a while, since he'd lost his apartment. I said yes, even though I had serious reservations about getting involved again. When Jake showed up at my door 3 days later, I barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, his hair was longer and unkempt, and his clothes looked like they'd been slept in for weeks. But the biggest change was in his demeanor. The cocky, charismatic guy who'd been charming his way through life was gone. This Jake looked broken. "Jesus, what happened to you?" I asked. "Detroit happened," he said. "Can I come in?" Jake's story of his time in Detroit was like something out of a crime movie, except it was real and it was my brother who had lived it. He'd tried to get into drug dealing like he'd planned, but he'd quickly discovered that he was completely out of his depth. The people Rick had introduced him to weren't small-time dealers looking for a new partner. They were serious criminals who saw Jake as either a potential asset or a potential threat. "I thought I was street smart," Jake said. We were sitting in my living room, and he was drinking his 4th cup of coffee since he'd arrived. "I thought because I'd been successful with the ticket thing, I could handle anything. I was so wrong." Jake's first week in Detroit, he'd been staying with Rick and trying to make connections in the drug trade. He'd met with a few different people, trying to find someone who'd front him product so he could start selling. But everyone could tell he was an amateur. He didn't know the terminology, he didn't understand how the business worked, and most importantly, he didn't understand the violence that was inherent in that world. This one guy, Deshaun, he agreed to front me a small amount of cocaine, Jake continued. "Nothing major. Maybe $1,000 worth of product that I was supposed to sell for $1,500. I thought it would be easy money." But Jake had immediately made a series of crucial mistakes. First, he'd tried to sell to college students near Wayne State University, figuring they'd be easy customers. What he didn't realize was that area was already controlled by other dealers who didn't appreciate the competition. Second, he'd been carrying the drugs around in his car without understanding proper protocol for avoiding police. Third, and most importantly, he'd been flashing money and talking too much, drawing attention to himself in a business where discretion was everything. "I lasted exactly 4 days," Jake said. 4 days, and I'd already pissed off the local dealers, almost got arrested twice, and lost half the product to some kids who just took it and ran when they realized I wasn't going to do anything about it. When Jake went back to Deshaun to explain what had happened, Deshaun's response was swift and educational. Jake got beaten up, not severely enough to require hospitalization, but enough to make it clear that this wasn't a business where you could just write off losses and try again next time. "They took the $8,000, Jake said. "All of it. Said it was payment for the lost product, plus interest, plus a fee for wasting their time." So Jake was back to square one, except now he was in Detroit with no money, no car. Deshaun's people had taken that too, and no way to get home. He'd spent the next month doing odd jobs for Rick. Construction work, moving furniture, anything that paid cash. Just trying to save up enough money for a bus ticket back to Cleveland. But what about Tommy? I asked. You said you worked something out with him. Jake's expression got even more grim. Yeah, we worked something out. The arrangement Jake had made with Tommy Marconi was what you might generously call a payment plan, or what you might more accurately call indentured servitude. Jake would work for Tommy's construction company for the next 2 years at minimum wage, and his entire paycheck would go toward paying off his debt. Tommy would provide Jake with a place to live, a studio apartment above a garage, and a small weekly allowance for food and basic expenses. It's basically like being in prison, Jake said, except I still have to pay for my own food. The math was brutal. At minimum wage, working full-time, Jake would make about $15,000 a year, which meant it would take him well over 2 years to pay off the $18,000 he owed, assuming no additional interest or fees. And knowing Tommy's reputation, there would definitely be additional fees. Why didn't you just declare bankruptcy? I asked. Jake gave me a look like I was the stupidest person on earth. You can't declare bankruptcy on debt to people like Tommy. That's not how it works. So Jake was trapped. He couldn't leave Cleveland because Tommy would find him. He couldn't get a different job because he was contractually obligated to work for Tommy. He couldn't even quit because the contract he'd signed under duress, but still legally binding according to Tommy's lawyers, included penalties for early termination that would add another $10,000 to his debt. I'm basically a slave, Jake said. A very well-educated, formerly successful slave. Watching my brother come to terms with his new reality was heartbreaking. This was someone who'd been living in a luxury apartment and driving a BMW just 2 months earlier. Now he was asking if he could borrow money from me to buy groceries. But I also felt a complicated sense of satisfaction, not because I wanted to see Jake suffer, but because for the first time in his life, he was facing real consequences for his actions. All his charisma and charm and ability to talk his way out of trouble hadn't saved him. The universe had finally caught up with him. Jake started working for Tommy the following Monday. The job was exactly as miserable as advertised. He'd wake up at 5 a.m., work construction all day in whatever weather, then come home exhausted and filthy to his tiny apartment. His weekly allowance was $150, which had to cover food, laundry, transportation, and any other necessities. The first few weeks were the hardest. Jake had never done manual labor before, and his body wasn't prepared for the physical demands. He'd come over to my place after work sometimes, and I could see him trying not to wince when he sat down or reached for something. His hands, which had been soft from his life as a ticket scalper, were now calloused and cut up from handling construction materials. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological adjustment. Jake had spent years being the guy with all the answers, the guy with the schemes and the connections and the inside information. Now he was just another construction worker taking orders from foremen who treated him like dirt. You know what the worst part is? Jake said one evening. We were eating dinner at my apartment. I'd started cooking extra food and inviting him over because I knew he couldn't afford to eat well on his allowance. It's that everyone at the job site knows my story. Tommy told them who I am and why I'm working for him. They think it's hilarious. The other workers had nicknamed Jake Tickets and would constantly ask him when he was going to hook them up with concert tickets. They'd make jokes about him being a big shot who'd been brought down to earth. A few of the older guys seemed to take pity on him, but most of them enjoyed having someone to look down on. There's this one guy, Sal, who's been working construction for like 20 years, Jake said. Every day he tells me I should be grateful for the opportunity to learn what real work feels like. Every single day. But slowly, something interesting started to happen. Jake began to adapt. The work was hard, but it wasn't complicated, and there was something to be said for the simplicity of it. Show up, do your job, go home. No schemes, no networking, no staying up all night planning the next big score. His body got stronger. His hands got tougher. He learned skills he'd never thought he'd need. How to operate power tools, how to read blueprints, how to work efficiently as part of a team. More importantly, he started to develop relationships with some of his coworkers that weren't based on what he could do for them or what they could do for him. Sal's actually not a bad guy, Jake told me after about 3 months on the job. Yesterday he helped me figure out why my car was making that weird noise. Didn't want anything in return, just helped because that's what you do for people you work with. Throughout his ticket scalping career, every relationship had been transactional. He'd buy tickets from venue employees who'd tip him off about upcoming sales. He'd pay people to stand in line for him. He'd charm venue managers who might give him information about capacity or demand. But these construction workers were operating on a different set of principles. Everyone was trying to get one over on everyone else. But construction workers, Jake was learning, had to depend on each other for safety and efficiency. If someone messed up, everyone suffered. If someone got hurt, everyone felt responsible. It's like a family, Jake said. A really dysfunctional, profanity-filled family that smells like concrete dust, but still a family. About 6 months into Jake's sentence with Tommy, something happened that changed everything. They were working on a renovation project at an old warehouse when one of the newer guys, Carlos, made a mistake with a support beam. The beam came down and caught Sal underneath it, pinning his leg. Jake was the first person to reach him. While everyone else was panicking or running for help, Jake managed to get a car jack from someone's truck and used it to lift the beam enough for others to pull Sal out. Sal's leg was broken in 2 places, but it could have been much worse if Jake hadn't acted quickly. After that, everything changed, Jake told me. It wasn't just that they respected me more, though they did. did. It was that I felt like I belonged somewhere for the first time in years. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Jake had spent years trying to be somebody special, someone who stood out from the crowd and commanded attention. But the first time he'd felt genuinely valued by a group of people was when he'd simply done the right thing without thinking about what was in it for him. Sal was out of work for 3 months while his leg healed, and Jake took it upon himself to visit him regularly, help with errands, and make sure he was doing okay. This wasn't part of Jake's job description, and Tommy wasn't paying him to do it. Jake was just doing it because Sal was his friend, and that's what friends do for each other. When I was scalping tickets, Jake reflected, I thought I was providing value to people, but really, I was just extracting value. I was making money off of other people's desire to see music, but I wasn't actually contributing anything positive to the world. This construction work, we're building things. We're making spaces where people can work and live and create. There's something honest about that. This was a side of Jake I'd never seen before. The old Jake would have been counting down the days until his debt was paid off and planning his next get-rich-quick scheme. This Jake was talking about maybe staying in construction even after his obligation to Tommy was finished. I mean, I'm not saying I want to do this forever, he said, but I'm learning skills that will always be valuable. And I'm working with people who actually care about doing good work, not just making money. Tommy, meanwhile, had been watching Jake's transformation with interest. According to Jake, Tommy had expected him to quit or try to run away within the first few months. When Jake not only stuck with it but actually became a valuable employee, Tommy started treating him less like an indentured servant and more like a regular worker. He gave me a raise, Jake said after about 8 months. Not a big one, but still. And he said if I keep working hard, he might be willing to renegotiate the terms of my debt. This was huge. Tommy wasn't known for his generosity, but he was a businessman, and good workers were hard to find. Jake had gone from being a liability to being an asset, and Tommy was pragmatic enough to recognize that. But the biggest change in Jake wasn't his relationship with Tommy or his coworkers. It was his relationship with himself. The old Jake had been constantly anxious, always looking over his shoulder for the next opportunity or the next threat. This Jake seemed calmer, more centered, more comfortable in his own skin. I sleep better now, he said. I know that sounds weird, but I do. When I was scalping tickets, I was always wired, always thinking about the next score. Now, when I go to bed, I know I put in an honest day's work, and that's enough. The local music scene had also moved on from Jake's ticket scalping era. New venues had opened, new policies had been implemented to prevent large-scale scalping, and the community had developed better systems for fans to buy and sell tickets among themselves. The Facebook page dedicated to hating Jake had been quiet for months, but Jake's story wasn't over. About 10 months into his work for Tommy, Jake got an opportunity that would test whether his transformation was real or just a temporary adaptation to his circumstances. Carlos, the guy whose mistake had led to Sal's injury, came to Jake with a proposition. Carlos had been planning to quit his job with Tommy and start his own small construction company. He'd saved up enough money to buy some basic equipment, and he'd lined up a few residential projects through family connections. What he needed was a partner, someone with business skills who could handle the administrative side while Carlos managed the actual construction work. He wants me to go in 50-50 with him, Jake told me. I'd handle bookkeeping, customer relations, job scheduling, all the business stuff. He'd handle the actual building. It was a tempting offer. Jake had learned enough about construction to know what he was talking about, and his business degree and experience running his ticket scalping operation had given him skills that Carlos lacked. They could probably make good money, especially since they'd be their own bosses instead of working for Tommy. But there was a catch. Leaving Tommy's employ before his debt was fully paid would trigger the penalty clause in his contract, adding another $10,000 to what he owed. Jake would have to convince Tommy to release him from his contract, or find a way to pay off his entire remaining debt up front. What are you going to do? I asked. I honestly don't know, Jake said. The old me would have just run off with Carlos and figured out how to deal with Tommy later, but I can't do that anymore. This was the real test of Jake's transformation. Was he really a different person, or was he just temporarily playing the role of a reformed bad guy until a better opportunity came along? Jake spent 2 weeks thinking about Carlos's offer. He talked to Sal about it, got advice from some of the other guys at work, and even had a surprisingly honest conversation with Tommy about his situation. Tommy told me something interesting, Jake said. He said when he first met me, he thought I was just another entitled rich kid who'd never faced real consequences for anything. He figured I'd either run away or break down within a month. The fact that I stuck with it and became a decent worker impressed him more than I realized. Tommy's proposal was unexpected. Instead of holding Jake to the full terms of his original contract, Tommy offered to let Jake buy his way out for $8,000, the remaining principal on his debt, without the accumulated interest and penalties. It was still a lot of money that Jake didn't have, but it was manageable if Carlos's business venture worked out. There's one condition, Jake said. If I take the deal and Carlos's business fails, I come back to work for Tommy for another year at the original terms. It's like Tommy's insurance policy. Jake decided to take the risk. He and Carlos formed their company, which they called Kowalski Martinez Construction. Jake used his remaining savings and borrowed some money from me to pay off Tommy, and they launched their business with a small renovation project for one of Carlos's relatives. They were working longer hours than they ever had for Tommy, but making less money because they were reinvesting everything back into the business. They had to learn how to bid on jobs, manage cash flow, deal with suppliers, and handle all the administrative headaches that came with running a small business. But unlike Jake's ticket scalping operation, this business was built on providing genuine value to customers. They were helping people improve their homes, fix problems, create spaces they could be proud of. The work was satisfying in a way that scalping tickets never had been. Yesterday, we finished this bathroom renovation for an elderly couple, Jake told me. The woman started crying when she saw it because she said it was the most beautiful room in her house. When's the last time someone cried tears of joy because of something I did? 6 months into the Kowalski Martinez Martinez construction venture, they were starting to make a profit. Word of mouth was bringing them new customers, and they were building a reputation for quality work at fair prices. Jake was handling the business side competently, and Carlos was proving to be an excellent craftsman. But the real measure of Jake's transformation came when they got an unexpected offer. A local promoter, someone who'd heard about Jake's ticket scalping background, approached him with a business proposition. The promoter was planning a music festival and wanted to hire Jake as a consultant on ticket sales and distribution. The pay would be excellent, more than Jake was making with the construction business, and it would be a chance to get back into the music industry that had made him rich before. He said I had unique insights into how scalping works, Jake told me. He wants me to help design a system that would prevent scalping while maximizing ticket sales revenue. It was the kind of opportunity the old Jake would have jumped at immediately. Good money, a chance to be the smartest guy in the room again, a return to the world where he'd once been successful. I asked. I told him no. Just like that? Just like that. I realized that I don't want to go back to that world. Even if I'm on the legitimate side of it now, it's still about manipulating people's desires and extracting maximum value from their emotions. I'd rather build something than optimize the extraction of money from people. That was the moment I knew Jake's transformation was real. He'd been offered a golden ticket back to his old life, and he'd turned it down because he'd found something better, not more profitable but more meaningful. Kowalski Martinez Construction continued to grow. They hired their first employee, a young guy fresh out of trade school who reminded me of Jake when he was younger. Ambitious, confident, maybe a little too sure of himself. But Jake and Carlos were good mentors, teaching him not just the technical skills but also the importance of treating customers and coworkers with respect. The kid keeps asking me about shortcuts and ways to make quick money, Jake said. I told him the only shortcut is to do good work consistently and build a reputation you can be proud of. He thinks I'm being naive, but he'll learn. The old Jake definitely would have thought he was being naive. The old Jake was all about shortcuts and quick scores and getting one over on other people. But this Jake had learned something valuable during his time working for Tommy. Sustainable success comes from providing genuine value, not from exploiting weaknesses in systems or people. 2 years after Jake's ticket scalping empire collapsed, I was standing in a living room that Kowalski Martinez Construction had just finished remodeling. The homeowners were showing off the work to their friends, talking about how professional and reliable Jake and Carlos had been. One of them mentioned that Jake was the same guy who used to be the famous ticket scalper, and everyone was surprised. He's completely different now, the homeowner said. You'd never know he used to be that guy. Jake was in the other room, discussing a potential project with another potential client. I could hear him explaining their process, their timeline, their pricing. He was still charismatic and articulate, but in a completely different way. Instead of using his charm to manipulate people, he was using it to make them feel comfortable and confident in his abilities. The final piece of poetic justice came 3 years after the Snoop Dogg incident. Snoop was coming back to Cleveland for another show, and this time the venue had implemented a comprehensive anti-scalping system. Tickets were tied to photo IDs, there were limits on how many one person could buy, and there were severe penalties for reselling above face value. Jake got tickets through the normal process like everyone else. He paid face value, stood in line like a regular person, and attended the show without any ulterior motives. It was probably the first concert he'd been to in years where he was just there to enjoy the music. It was actually better, he told me afterward. I could just focus on the performance instead of calculating how much money I could have made. During the show, Jake ran into Marcus, the guy who'd organized the anti-scalping campaign years earlier. Marcus didn't recognize him at first. Jake looked completely different with his construction worker build and more modest clothes, but when Jake introduced himself, Marcus was shocked. I thought you disappeared forever, Marcus said. I heard you lost everything and went into hiding. I did lose everything, Jake replied. Best thing that ever happened to me. They ended up having a beer together after the show, and Marcus later told people that he couldn't believe it was the same person. The arrogant, parasitic ticket scalper had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humble and self-aware. Kowalski Martinez Construction is still operating today. They've got 6 employees now and a solid reputation in the Cleveland area. Jake handles the business operations and occasionally does some of the lighter construction work. He makes a decent living, not the massive amounts he was making during his scalping days, but enough to live comfortably and save for the future. More importantly, Jake is happy in a way I'd never seen him before. He has real friendships with his coworkers, a sense of pride in his work, and the satisfaction of knowing that he's contributing something positive to the world. The house of cards that was Jake's ticket scalping empire collapsed in spectacular fashion when Snoop Dogg canceled that show. But from the wreckage, Jake built something much more valuable, a life with meaning and purpose. The instant karma that destroyed his old life created space for his new one. And those 2,000 worthless Snoop Dogg tickets? Jake still has them, framed in his office as a reminder of the most expensive lesson he ever learned.